Something that often goes unnoticed with Mario Kart is how good its track design generally is. I wouldn't say it's underrated, but more so taken for granted. And I suppose that's natural. After all, it can be much easier to see what doesn't work in a game than what does. At the same time though, there's no doubt that some courses are better than others. So today, let's take a look at the do's and don'ts of Mario Kart's numerous tracks. Without further ado, let's get started. Hey there, I'm Kardino. First things first, how are we going to judge these things? I didn't want to just give them an arbitrary score because it honestly wouldn't be that helpful. What distinguishes a 6 from an 8? How I'm feeling that day? I wanted to be a bit more thoughtful than that. So I decided to use a two-dimensional rating system measuring creativity and execution. Both will be rated on a scale of 1 to 5, and from there they can be combined to make an overall score. The creativity portion is measuring how high concept the track is. What's the surrounding theme? How many twists and turns are there? Are there any unique obstacles? Stuff like that. The execution is how fun the track is to play in engine, how fun the turns are to make, how obtrusive the obstacles are, and whether there are any risky shortcuts. Of course, this will all be graded on a curve. I'm not expecting 64's level of track design from 8. I mean, just comparing them, we can immediately expect 8 times better track design here. Now, a few questions you may have. First, isn't this an overcomplicated method for a score that's still handpicked regardless? Maybe, but I do think the scores are slightly more objective for it. I may prefer Rock Mountain to Music Park, but it didn't get the higher score here. I have to draw the line somewhere. Second, what about retro tracks? How will their scores be affected? Well, for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to exclude them. I'm only going to talk about the tracks specifically made for each game, which can sometimes even help them. Finally, isn't the actual track layout more important than the surrounding idea? What if a track is really fun to play on, but doesn't have a crazy gimmick? To solve this issue, I'm going to weigh things in favor of execution. Consider 3 to be the default score. I'm not having a blast, but I'm not bored either. Whereas creativity's base score is 1 and goes up from there. This means your average beginner circuit will get a 4 out of 10, for example. If only for this video, please don't count a 5 as bad, just a little forgettable. So now that we've established our rubric, I'm going to present a selection of courses and explain my reasoning for each placement. Starting at the top, we have the masterpieces, tracks that are very high concept and an immediate selection. It's also the most obvious category, with few to no surprises. Mount Wario, Big Blue, basically a third of Mario Kart Wii's list. But I like to specifically look at Daisy Cruiser. You start off on the sunny deck, swerving around the pool. From there you head into the darker cabins, with moving tables creating a dynamic obstacle. Then the hallway with the yawning pit to avoid. But if you do fall down, it's actually an engine room with items. Thus, a decision is presented. Do you take the slightly slower route for a possible weapon, or take the standard path? Lastly, a wide turn completes the lap. Needless to say, the different paths and scenarios keep you fully engaged the entire time. And the premise, combined with the different levels of lighting, makes this quite memorable too. But what about a less textbook example? I present to you Vanilla Lake 1. With how low contrast this track is, I was expecting not to like it that much, but no, it's the best course in the entire game. First, the scenery is refreshing after various levels of green and brown tracks. Plus, while the map is pretty straightforward, each corner offers a different type of challenge. Not only do we see the pipes are turning as a stationary obstacle, but the ice blocks are also introduced, which break apart as a racer hits them. This means that not only are you punished by physically slowing down, but you also make the track easier for everyone in future laps. Lastly, the water is well implemented. It's by far the most punishing hazard in the game, but it's only used to require players to turn sharper or swerve to the side. Again, it's nothing to write home about today, but for SMK standards, you couldn't do much better. Alright, what should we look at next? What about something with high creativity, but poor execution? Well, I didn't find any I'd rate as a 5 and 1. 4s and 2s are pretty common, albeit controversial. A standard example, though, would be Twisted Mansion. Taking a haunted house and combining it with anti-gravity seems like an easy win. It even has some split paths. But nonetheless, it does feel a little disappointing, and I think it's because of the middle portion. Unless the place was dimly lit, I think the underwater passage was a little unwelcome. Besides some bonefish, there's nothing spooky or mystical about it, at least in the context of the game. Also, the gliding segment is kinda pointless. They're typically what cannons used to be in the old games, but with a bit of interactivity. The balcony is an interesting expansion of the idea, but it's just way too easy to land on. I would have preferred to see more of the haunted library. Maybe have flying books or rats running around? Here's an idea: have 2 paths with a boost panel on one and the other without. Then as you drive closer, each archway darkens, forcing you to remember which path was better. I have no idea how I'm gonna illustrate that, but I'm sure I'll figure something out when I'm editing. But regardless, let's take a look at a more unpopular pick. Yoshi Valley is well remembered for its ambitious idea: make a track so complicated that even the game can't show the placings. But then when you actually play it, a problem becomes apparent. There is clearly a correct way to go. For example, if you go right at this junction, it is inarguably the wrong way. But maybe that's the point. The best route is clearly pretty risky. Look how thin this is. But that leads me to my next point. The punishment for falling is way too harsh. I'm all for some precarious options, but when the punishment is basically a 7-second setback, I have problems. And that isn't exclusive to the shorter path. So while the concept is good on paper, unless you have several possible layouts, there is a critical flaw that only punishes new players. Very similar to this is Lakeside Park. With such a creative theme for its time and a compelling track layout, it's easy to love. But then you drift a little too wide and get sent back to an earlier part of the track. Just like that, your hope for first place is gone. Now, I do find things like this funny in theory or retrospect, but in the moment, you just groan with frustration. But let's flip the situation. Let's take a look at some instances of great track design while still having a simple premise. These are what I like to call the sleeper hits. Tracks that may be hard to remember or are initially disappointing, but redeem themselves upon repetition. Tracks just like DS Mario Circuit. Appearing in the Star Cup, it has a more challenging layout than its siblings. Whereas many will have long stretches with nothing of note, this one swerves and twists. It even throws Goombas and Piranha Plants into the mix. It's very similar to the GameCube version in that aspect. But I singled out this version because despite its qualities, there's no real staying power. In fact, although it's not factoring into its rating, I think it's appropriate to share an anecdotal point. When this course was brought over to the BCP, I think a lot of people were disappointed. It felt a little anticlimactic to bring back Mario Circuit of all things, instead of something more popular. But I also think people mellowed out after playing the track again, especially considering the environmental upgrade. The track doesn't have to have constant contortions though. Sometimes a dynamic experience is enough. To that point, let's go to Rock Mountain. Once again, the concept is very simple, especially with other mountain tracks. Instead of riding down a ski slope or going through a dam, this one is no more than what it says on the tin. You start on a mountain, go through a small cave, and glide through a valley of pine trees. Then, it's simply a matter of turning and heading up a giant slope past some falling rocks before repeating the journey. I rated this one so highly because I think it's one of the best uses of the gliding mechanic. Like I said before, it's often used as an interactive cutscene of sorts. But here, you can drop as soon as you like. But unless you're playing competitively, you want to catch wind to fly longer. Ultimately, you couldn't have many tracks like this without it getting stale, so I understand why they limited themselves. But it does give things a bit of unique flavor. Once again though, nobody's mind is getting blown, so it's a bit lost in the crowd. Otherwise, there are plenty more examples I could pull. Banshee Boardwalk can be a fun challenge in its original engine, but barely leans into the Ghost theme. DK Pass and Shroom Ridge are also good examples. Next, we'll take a look at the ones that reach the standard, but don't go much farther. For that, we find ourselves at Double Dash's Luigi Circuit. I'll start off by saying that it's way better than your standard beginner course. In fact, I'd say this and 8s are the only ones really worth talking about. It takes a basic idea, then adds a twist by having the front-running and trailing racers pass by. Now, in reality, how much does this mechanic really add? Not much, but it's something. The risky alternate path is also quite welcome, as it only works when someone else is distracting the chain chomp. So it definitely earns its points here, but it's not setting out to do anything too ambitious like Mario Kart Stadium. And that's perfectly fine, but it's going to be easily overshadowed. If I wanted to keep with staple tracks, I could point to Rainbow Road from either DS or 8, but I feel like the reasons are fairly obvious. Both have a couple interesting elements, but ultimately feel a little underwhelming. So let's go with Snowland instead. There's some stuff to like. The snowmen, the penguins, and cracks in the ice are nice obstacles. Plus, the shape of the track isn't too bad. But what keeps it from greatness is that those hazards don't really get in the way all too much. Unless you're about to swerve off-road anyway, it's almost all scenery. Again, I'd point to Vanilla Lake 1 as a great example of an ice track, but I'm not bored while playing this either. Alright, let's get down to business. These are the tracks with frustrating or boring track design and little to no creative appeal. Unsurprisingly, they're somewhat rare. As I already stated, Mario Kart's track design is one of its most consistent, though sometimes invisible qualities. So it's probably a little harsh when I name Donut Plains 3 as not only the worst track in its game, but also the worst one in the series. Then again, I don't like playing this one at all. First, it gets no creative points for using its setting yet again. It's bad enough with the Mario circuits, but unlocking the secret final courses only for the first one to be yet another grassy field is more than a little disappointing. Plus, we get no new ideas for obstacles. But most importantly, the track design is way too unforgiving. For example, at the very beginning of the race, everyone is immediately compressed into a narrow path with some bridges. As I mentioned before, the water is the harshest punishment in the game, so it should only be used if you seriously mess up. But here, if you don't time your hop correctly or even get bumped by another player, you're losing a good chunk of time. Next comes a winding path, which is not suitable for SMK's engine. It can be done, but most players will probably opt to just cut the corners. Finally, if you don't nail these turns, you'll find yourself sliding into Monty Mole territory. Don't get me wrong, if you get lucky with item rolls and play this track repeatedly like I did, you can somewhat master it, but I still don't think it's very enjoyable. Luckily, there aren't any other tracks quite that bad in future games, but there are still some stinkers. How about Rainbow Road from 64? Who doesn't love racing in a pitch black void on a road with 0 places to fall off? It gets a single point for the chain chomps, which appear every so often, but otherwise, your only source of amusement is the light show. I might give it a point for that if there was an actual background, but no. We're not on the Super Nintendo anymore, so it doesn't even have lack of power as an excuse. And lastly, in a game where red shells are all but useless, it's pretty easy for leads to gradually build. That is, unless you have the most elastic rubber banding computer ever. Those are the two most interesting examples. The only other really bad tracks are circuits, but that's to be expected. You're telling me Figure 8 and Toad Circuit aren't high quality tracks? Shocking, I know. So now that we've got a spread of examples here, let me present some conclusions I found. First, try to steer away from simple track design. At best, you end up with a divisive course like Baby Park. At worst, you leave the fun at the mercy of items. Second, an easy way to get people's attention is to place hazards on the road, especially if they move. Thwomps, cars, and Mecha Koopas are good examples. But they work with the track, not by themselves. The older games are actually pretty good at this for all their basic ideas. Third, be careful with how harsh the punishment for making a mistake is. Sending someone back or otherwise inflicting a major time penalty, except in extreme circumstances, is funny in theory, but not so in action. Even something like Toad's Turnpike isn't as fun as it could be because of how long the tumble animation lasts. I'd argue that's its crippling flaw, in fact. Fourth, it's okay to have simple settings or to even reuse them. The track design will just have to compensate if it's going to be memorable. At their best, they can have their own appeal apart from the bombastic set pieces. Fifth, having multiple routes is a risky notion. Unless it's blocked by an item, there's usually an optimal path that people will learn. And from there, the rest of the track goes unutilized. For good examples, look at Electrodrome or Delfino Square. Next, there's a fine balance to make with shortcuts. They have to be easy enough that people want to risk using them, but hard enough where it presents an actual choice. For example, the shortcut in Wario's Gold Mine is a little too easy, so not taking it feels more like a penalty. The jump in Wario Colosseum is another fair example. On the flip side, I don't know anyone who took the shortcut near the end of Woohoo Loop. Lastly, and most importantly, if you're going to set a course in the desert, you better have the best ideas of all time. Having some pyramids in the background isn't going to cut it. 64 tried having a train get in the way, and that didn't work. A couple others had their moments, but the only one that fully succeeded was Wii. And again, that game is so good, the Mushroom Cup is iconic. Anyway, let's wrap up this discussion by seeing how good each game's tracks are on average. Remember, 6 is the goal. We start off with Super Mario Kart with a score that's just okay. Again, this is after the curve. I know it doesn't look great, but it was the first of its series and still experimenting. And you know what? It's still better than 64. While it had more highs than lows, it had a lot of rough spots. Perhaps most importantly, it didn't have any 9s or 10s, so the bad apples soured the final score more heavily. Credit where it's due though, it often has strong atmosphere. The sunsets all provoke different feelings, Frappe Snowland has a unique Winter Wonderland charm, and even Bowser Castle has some dark corridors and this execution chamber, which leave a sinister impression. Luckily, Super Circuit picked up the slack with no outright bad tracks. In fact, I think it's fair to call it a better SMK. Then we reach Double Dash, where things take another leap. If I wasn't the kind of guy to spend several of its nights filling out an Excel sheet, I'd probably round it up to a 7. There's only one track here that isn't at least a 5, and even then, I wonder if it didn't deserve better. We do take a dip with DS. A lot of these tracks get a 4 or 5. And of course, Figure 8 Circuit is there too. But Wii jumps in and blows all of these scores out of the water. Its secret? 12 out of 16 tracks got a 7 or higher, with the remainder getting 5s. That is simply incredible. 7 isn't too bad either. It may not quite reach Double Dash's average, but certainly gives it a run for its money. Last of all, 8 comes in with a very respectable number. In fact, out of 25 original tracks, only 2 of them fell under a 5. So while it comes out with a lower overall mean than Wii, I think it's mostly a result of having more tracks to juggle. Looking at the progress overall, we can see that ever since 64, the series has been on solid footing. You'd think the new gimmicks would tempt the developers to get overly ambitious, but that isn't really the case. Again, that's more than a lot of series can say, so good for them. Anyway, I hope that was a fun look into Mario Kart's track design. I felt it deserved some attention because when you're playing these things dozens, if not hundreds of times, subtle details can really affect your impression. Again, I even surprised myself with some of these ratings. But if you want to see what I thought of every Nitro track from SMK Few 8, I made a companion video on my DX channel that you may find interesting. But until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.